From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Hello and welcome to Middle East Focus, a weekly podcast on regional affairs and U.S. policy produced by the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. My name is Matthew Czekaj, the managing editor at MEI. Over the past 4 months, Iran has attacked or been engaged in missile exchanges with several of its neighbors, most notably strikes and counterstrikes involving Pakistan in January and Israel this past April. In particular, the massive Iranian missile and drone strike against Israel, which featured hundreds of launchers and multiple lines of attack, was unprecedented in its scale and for the fact that most of the missiles were fired directly from Iranian territory. But the overwhelming majority never reached their targets, having been shot down, fallen short, or having failed to launch at all. About a week later, Israel carried out its own limited retaliatory strike on Iran, which took out an Iranian S-300 missile defense radar. These incidents, and especially the mid-April attacks, generated a heated debate among Iran watchers and the wider defense community about what lessons we can draw about Iranian capabilities, both offensive and defensive. Is Iran a larger or lesser threat than we previously assumed? What can we say about its ability to detect, intercept, or weather incoming strikes? And as Iran seemingly continues on its path to develop a nuclear bomb, how should we evaluate the Iranian leadership's threshold for hostile behavior? For this week's episode, we've invited 2 expert guests willing to wade into this debate. First, we have David DesRoches, a professor with the Near East South Asia Center at the National Defense University. Our second guest is Abdolrasool Divsallar, who also goes by Farzam. Farzam is a senior researcher in the Middle East WMD Free Zone project at the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research. It will be a lively and insightful discussion. You can subscribe to Middle East Focus on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and other podcast providers. Dave, Farzam, it's a pleasure having you both on. Welcome. To start off, I wanted to ask kind of a general question. What did we think we knew about the Iranian missile, drone, and air defense capabilities at the end of 2023, and how has that view changed in the past 4 months? Dave?
Well, we knew they had a lot of missiles. We knew they had a lot of drones. We knew that their accuracy has increased significantly in recent years, that they've gone from being general attack to precision attack capable. We knew that they had a lot of drones that they could launch from multiple points, and that the range on the drones was greater than it had been in the past, but they were generally incapable of active guidance in large numbers, so that basically the drones would be operating on a sort of dead reckoning path, which makes them easy to, if you acquire them, they're easy to intercept. We knew less about Iranian air defense because it hasn't really been tested. They've been talking about things, and developing capabilities. We saw a pretty successful Pakistani raid against Iran, but I don't think we can draw any conclusions from that because it was in Balochistan. And, it's just basically a region that's not really defended as a priority. The big area that we still don't know a whole lot about is the effectiveness or the ineffectiveness of Iranian air defense, which still seems to suffer from both a sort of patchwork of different systems and questions about command and control. I think that what the attack revealed was information not about capabilities, but about intention. And the intention and the resolve to launch such a large attack was, I think, a surprise for many people. And that, I think, is the real significant factor here.
Farzam, what internal and external factors do you think pushed Iran to engage in this series of standoff attacks in January, including this exchange with Pakistan?
Well, I think there are, especially if we take into account the case of Israel, which I would like to focus more, I think there were a lot of reasons, but more importantly, 2 important factors. The first was, I think, a sort of consensus about the scale and urgency of Israeli threat. I think what has changed was basically an understanding that change was because of the Israeli attack to the consulate of Iran in Damascus, was that the Israeli targeting model is changing. That basically means that while Israel before was targeting more sort of technical people or operational commanders like General Razi Mousavi or Fakhrizadeh, which were basically more technocrats or operational commanders, now it's shifting to political military leadership. In this case, it was General Zahedi. So basically that means for the Iranians that the next target could have been even Iranian foreign minister or any member of sort of elite political military leadership. So this clearly put in question the value of restraint and value of not engagement, because the understanding was that, well, Israel is already benefiting from using its military tools, while Iran may need to absorb even more painful costs. The second factor I would say is the reason and the rationale behind is about the problem with the broader general Iranian deterrence that might have been weakened, especially if change in Israeli targeting could have become more consistent and form a sort of pattern. Like if you compare it with what during the Trump administration, U.S. assassination of Soleimani, we see that that was an isolated event. But I think as what we know from Israeli way of operation is that it has a more possibility to become a form of sustained operation. And that makes really the threat level different and puts the deterrence in question. And also it was the issue of attribution and public cost, hitting the consulate, put Iran in a position that it was not really able to escape from this sort of attribution cost. So as a result, the general deterrence the risk was that it could fall. And profoundly important is the fact that, for deterrence, for maintaining your deterrence, you need to make a threat credible. And that's the core, I think, of a Iranian response in a way that they wanted to make their threat credible. They wanted to send the signal, not just they possess capability, but they are also willing and ready to use the force. And this fact is inherently linked with Israelis, as I said, rising confidence and a belief that Iran's domestic weakness makes it cautious in using force. So I think the combination of these factors was contributing to create a sort of consensus in Iranian military and security elites that the response should be urgent, and it should, of course, remain sub-threshold sort of retaliation, means a retaliation that transcends symbolism, send a strong message about Iran's readiness to use the force and show credibility, but remains below the threshold of war. And that's the core of, I think, Iran's strategy at the moment.
Dave, I'd like you to jump in on this as well in a second, but just to follow up on what you were saying, Farzam, do you feel that, or does Iranian leadership, I should say, feel that they've reasserted deterrence successfully, and has the message reached the rest of the region as well?
I think at least what we can see from public sort of statements and the general arguments and debates inside Iran is that, yes, they think that the deterrence was restored because basically, as also was mentioned by David, because the signal was properly strong enough to show that Iran is ready to use the force. Basically, here is when we talk about a concept of power and deterrence, as I said before, it's important that the two parts of deterrence, which the capability and willingness of use of force goes hand in hand. So I think from the Iranian perspective, that's what was lacked was this willingness, and the operation showed that there is the willingness to use of force, and there's not necessarily a fear of Israeli retaliation.
Dave, did you have anything to add on this?
A slight dissent on the Israeli calculus. And you notice that I picked the one area that neither Farzam or I can speak to authoritatively. But I don't think the Israelis viewed this as a escalation in the political military regime. And I think that it's a little overstated that they would maybe, attack military things. I think tactically, I think that the way they operate is they have a list of IRGC targets and people that they will, if they get the opportunity and the capability to do it, they will consider for elimination. And I think that acquiring the information that there were these three Revolutionary Guard officers in such close proximity, I think that it was tactical calculation, not political calculation and opportunity that allowed them to do that. I don't think that there was a great policy debate. I think the policy debate over striking IRGC leadership in Syria has been decided a long time ago, and opportunity is what drove this. But I can't prove that. That's just my operator's perspective on it.
So the Iranians launched hundreds of missiles, hundreds of drones from multiple locations, including with the help of some of their proxies and partners. In the end, I believe the Israelis were saying that the 95% were either shot down or failed to reach their targets. I saw some reporting saying that as many as half of the missiles failed to launch in the first place. Number one, how accurate do you think the reporting has been on the attack itself in April from Iran? And based on that and what we know about it, do you think it was more or less impressive than what experts feared could have been?
Well, I think before answering your question, I would like to add something about the previous discussion that we had about the strategy. I think one important message of this operation and the whole escalation that happened was sort of a show of a confidence on Iranian conventional deterrence. I think if you remember, there were some discussions about the fact that Iran's conventional deterrence might be weakening, or because of the Gaza war and because of the whole sort of escalations that were taking in the region. And some people were even arguing that that can contribute to Iran's nuclear program, renewal or sort of militarization of that. However, the operation showed that, Iranians are still relying on their conventional forces as their main capability, and they are quite confident on that. So basically, they can think that they're able to manage the crisis after use of that force. I think this is an important thing, and maybe I will return back to that when we talk about the nuclear implications of this incident. About what you said about the missile themselves, I think that's the Israeli claim. I think we need to be a bit conservative about this claim for several reasons. First and foremost, as was mentioned before, I think the arsenal size matters. We should remember that this was not a full-scale war. It demonstrates only possibility of the use of a force in a limited way, although it's 300, but the whole total number of drones, cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles, but the actual number of ballistic missiles was 110, as at least was seen. And as some sources in Iran claim, Iranians were ready for the second retaliation of daily shooting of 300 to 400 missiles. So basically, we are talking about a stockpile of over several 100,000 long-range missiles. So we are not talking about thousands of missiles. We're talking about 700,000 missiles. And that really changed the whole calculus because of just the impact that will have on any sort of defender. And then adding to that, you should realize that this was just the IRGC Air Force that used its assets. So, and as we know, the other elements of Iranian military are equipped with the similar drones and cruise missiles and ballistic missiles, and they were not part of the operation at all. So we just have a very vague idea about the size, and this operation showed that size matters, and I think that's an important factor. So about what you said, maybe I just add this point, and then I will return back to just not be so long, is that we all know that there was no elements of surprise. There were warnings, there were quite clear political messages about the fact that Iran is going to use probably missiles and is going to respond directly from its own soil. This was communicated through the Swiss embassy to Americans, and then shooting of the drones, giving that 7 hours flight pattern was quite clear that the operation is underway. So I think when we talk about the success rate of the air defense systems, given all the preparation time that we had, which basically is not at all similar to an actual war scenario, we need to all consider all these factors. And adding to that is the fact that, Iranians did not activate that much. Of course, they activated a bit Iraqi and Syrian front, but they did not activate it in a full scale sort of the axis of resistance capabilities in this approach. So what I'm trying to say is that we should be careful that do not see this as an actual military scenario, a war scenario to be precise. This was a mix of a military political operation to send a signal, which was basically strongly political in nature. This is not a war scenario. So judging based on that about effectiveness of air defense could be a bit problematic.
So you're basically talking about strategic holding back. When you mentioned that their announcement that they would, shoot, hundreds per day for however many days, do we have any other evidence to corroborate suspected, stockpile numbers besides this?
The only baseline I have is General McKenzie's testimony from 2022. He gave an estimate of over 3,000 ballistic missiles in Iran's inventories, and that excludes cruise missiles, and of course excludes drones. So presumably over 3,000 means less than 4,000. But, that was in 2002. It remains to be seen. Farzam raises a real interesting point, though, which was that this was almost entirely a Revolutionary Guard operation. And one of the neglected aspects, I think, is, and I don't know enough about this to pronounce decisively, but it's the Revolutionary Guard that was embarrassed by, having three of its senior leaders precisely pinpointed in a country that no Israeli has been legally present in since 1947. The Israeli attack on the Revolutionary Guard leaders in the consulate was timed, so that it occurred after the Iranian ambassador left, and it was, 20 feet from the Canadian consulate, which suffered no damage. There's a strong element, not just of national pride, but I think we also have to look at the Revolutionary Guard you can make a strong case that there's sort of a creeping coup. They control a large portion of the Iranian economy. And one motive that I think can't be overlooked is the fact that, after seeing people lost and, embarrassments like this, maybe they need to restore some sense of legitimacy and competence for their own internal audience, not just to deter Israel, but also to validate them as, the vanguard of the revolution, and a competent vanguard of the revolution. It's an interesting point that I think we will have to look for evidence down the line to reestablish.
Perfect point. Farzam, do you also see the IRGC as playing a central role in Iran's potential offensives in the region throughout? Are they, for lack of a better word, shadow decision makers on this?
Well, my assessment is a bit distant from Dave's. I think it's hard to attribute it only to IRGC. This is more a systemic decision. I see a strong evidence that this was a consensus-based decision based on a new understanding, as I mentioned, because of the change in the targeting model. We can argue that this was a tactical change in targeting model or a strategic, but it doesn't matter. The thing is that the embassy, which was under international law, had the immunity, it was targeted. So this was a big change in the norm of the conduct that was established between Iran and Israel over the past years. So this was big enough to put every elite member of the Islamic Republic in fear and in danger. So maybe should say that I enlarge David's model, that it's not just IRGC, it's all the whole leadership that feels what would be the next. I mean, would the next be the foreign minister, or who is the next, actually? What I'm trying to say is that I think this is more, given the knowing the Iran's decision-making cycle, especially when it comes to general staff, which you have a strong voice of Artesh and you have a strong voice of Ministry of Defense, which is basically an important part of the internal debate because of its complete control over the logistics and over the acquisition process, which usually gives it a very strong voice. I think in this sort of operation, we cannot reduce that to IRGC. That's very systemic. It's, I think, a decision that very much was involved with the supreme leader and was, again, involved with a general understanding about the future of Iran's deterrence.
Can I disagree just a little bit with my friend? So once again, first off, I welcome a renewed Iranian commitment to the sanctity of diplomatic missions. I'm of an era where it was something we disliked, but the obligation to protect a diplomatic mission is an obligation of the host country. For a third country, a diplomatic mission is the same as any other civilian target. It shouldn't be targeted under its own purposes, but if there's military activity going on there, then it is. And the Israelis have killed Revolutionary Guard officers in Iran. The Iranian consulate, the Iranian diplomatic mission is Iranian soil. I think that it is a mistake to view this as something that could be directed at the entire regime against the civilian leadership. I think the targets were Revolutionary Guard, as I said earlier, and I think that the fact where they were located was possibly a complicating factor, but I think that in the Israeli calculus, the fact that you had such senior officers with the Israel, the Palestine, Syria, and Lebanon portfolio in such close proximity, I think that they would have been a target just about anywhere they were located. And I don't think we're on the verge of seeing a wave of Israeli attacks against diplomats, Iranian diplomats, or diplomatic missions. I think that's misleading. And I think they'll target Revolutionary Guard leadership wherever they happen to be. That's the alpha and the omega of it. But again, you'll note that I cited something that I can neither prove nor disprove.
Let me switch gears a little bit here and move on to the Israeli retaliatory strike that happened about a week later. Dave, what do we know about the strike itself? Are there any lessons that we can glean from it? And then Farzam, if this attack in fact originated from inside Iran, as a lot of the reporting claims, what does that reveal about Iran's counter-espionage and internal security priorities and effectiveness?
Yeah, well, we don't know a whole lot, but what we do know is that the Iran assault seemed to stress numbers and quantity, and it seemed to be designed to impress Israel with, as Farzam stated, look, you're getting a proportion of our arsenal, And we can do this for day upon day upon day. So we have a lot of mass, and your air defense system may be capable of taking out one of these. But at the end of this demonstration, as the Iranian line goes, although I'm not so sure about that, take a look at your missile defense inventory and see what you have left and decide if you want to conduct an activity like this. I think that's about the most favorable spin you can do on it. The Israeli response, we have a couple questions about. The first one is, how much of it was limited by the Biden administration's entreaties? It's clear that the Biden administration does not want to see a broader war. Their actions have been limited, not just, in Syria after attacks on U.S. bases, the response against the Houthis, which is an extremely discriminate and proportionate response that has only attacked missile capabilities and radar facilities, not command and control centers or leadership of the Houthis. So I think the Biden administration leaned on the Israelis to have a very small response. And I think the response was precise, which was to destroy the Tombstone radar, one of the S-300 batteries, which, have only were the prime defense acquisition requirement for Iran for over 10 years, which had been embargoed by the Russians while the JCPOA story was played out. And then were finally transferred after, almost a decade of wait. Then we see that the key capability of one of these batteries that's in Natanz, that is part of the defense of Iran's nuclear site, is destroyed. I think Israel's hoping that will say, look, you think this will protect you, we can destroy it at any time, and you won't really know what happened. I will wait eagerly. History cannot come fast enough for me to find out exactly how this happened, how much was known of it. There were reports of drones being shot down. It'd be interesting to see if those drones were put in there to activate the radar or if they were just there to overwhelm command and control. But basically, the Iranian attack was bulk and mass. The Israeli response was small but extremely effective. I'm not sure if that message is as effective because people are just impressed by mass and bulk, but we'll see.
Well, a couple of points here. I think, we know very much about Iran's long challenges in its counter-espionage operations, and that's not so strange, I think, partly because probably it's a most concentrated espionage terrain in the world. We have a lot of global investment on espionage in Iran, so that sounds to me presence of intelligence operations in Iran is nothing new, and Iran's weakness on that is also nothing new. We saw that in the Israeli success in taking out nuclear files from Iran and even a lot of revelations about Iranian military capabilities. But what more important, I think, is also another factor, which is about a revelation of a traditional gap that was already been there for many years, which is about Iran's missile defense, which is nothing new again. Iranians were noted that at least since 2005, 2006, when they asked Russians to sell them S-300. They went through lots of modernization programs. The Iran's Ministry of Defense undertook a lot of modernization programs. And if you just look at the landscape of Iran's missile defense and air defense in general, and the change that it experienced since 2005 and 6 and now, you will see a lot of things have changed. Iran has improved a lot in the short-range missile and especially cruise defense. It has improved in sort of drone defense. It has built its own sort of indigenous air defense network, but all of them are technologically much behind what we see in the West, especially the common air defense picture that the US and Israel are building across the region. So I think there are major limits on what Iran can do technically, because we can expect that they go for buying more systems from Russians. But again, given the whole technological dimension of this, there are limits there, and there are limits on what Russia is really ready to supply to Iran, given its continuation of war in Ukraine. But what I think seems to be the Iranian response, and probably that's another cycle that we will see, is on two fronts. First is that I think Iran will shift, as I said, the priority already been there on air defense systems. So Iran will probably realize that as even more urgent as a priority. But I think another consequence will be Iran's shift toward forward air defense posture, which was basically in discussion and for debate for years, that Iran start to sort of selling or use its own air defense assets in Syria. But we should wait and see that front, I think, how that moves, if that project, given its complications, will be successful or not. Another thing which I think was mentioned also by Dave is that I think Iranian's strategy is completely different from Israeli strategy. Their strategy is based on changing or impacting the equation between offense and defense. Their strategy is using mass. Again, put it in a wartime scenario, everything is different. In a sustained wartime scenario, Israeli capability to shoot down each drone will cause the decline of their offensive capability. So if you consider the Israeli Air Force, the sortie that it can operate either for air defense mission or for offensive missions, the combined sortie will be impacted by the level of offensive capability that Iran will use. So what I'm trying to say is that I think Iranians are very much using for this sort of operational approach to as an alternative solution, as a response to their technological weakness. You imagine a scenario that Iran shoots or sends a lot of drones, a huge number of drones and missiles, and takes a lot of energy of Israeli Air Force for shooting down what it did in mid-April. And then at the same time, that means a reduction in Israeli capability of offense against Iranian targets. And then adding to this complexity is the geography of Iran, which basically can provide it a very good capacity to hide the offensive capabilities. And adding to another layer of complexity is the combination of the layers of a range that Iranian missiles have already been able to. So they have the capability to fire most eastern provinces close to Pakistan or the most western provinces. So basically that makes the war-like scenario very complex. So I really it's a question in my mind and I don't have the answer to that, if really that technological advantage of Israel in a real wartime scenario will become as a decisive factor for winning a war, or will protect Israel from a mass destruction strategy that Iran wants to impose on that.
Dave, do you agree with what Farzam was saying about the Israeli and partners' missile defense and air defense systems not being a sustainable option for dealing with the Iranian missile threat?
Well, I agree with it to a certain extent. Let's start with what I absolutely agree on. First off, Iran is a huge country. Israel is a small country. And Iran has spent decades building an offensive capability that would be very, very difficult to hit. So I think Israel's ability to remain on the defense and defeat missiles over a period of time fired from all the regions of Iran, plus Iran's proxies, that's not sustainable. The second thing, which Farzam only touched on obliquely, but I think we both agree, is that the economics of missile defense favor the attacker. So it costs, millions of dollars to bring down a missile that costs hundreds of thousands of dollars. And, one of your earlier questions, were the Iranians really serious about this, or were they just firing junk? Well, it doesn't matter in a missile defense scenario. You have to put as much effort into bringing down a crummy missile as bringing down an elite missile, provided that they're on the same track. There's some missiles that you can just say, okay, this is going to go into the ocean or into the desert, so we won't mess with it. So this idea of who's got the better missiles doesn't really apply. You spend $4.3 million to fire a Patriot missile at a bad missile, and you spend $4.3 million to fire a Patriot missile at a good missile if it's coming towards your capital city. That being said, what we have not seen is Iran flying missiles towards a country that has the resolve to attack Iran's strategic assets, Iranian cities, Iranian locations that, they want to defend. So I think that in the abstract, it is likely that if Iran were to fire missiles at Israel over an extended period of time at a large range like this, and Israel were not to engage in any kind of offensive response, it is possible that, you would start to see Israeli missile defense fail. I think that would apply towards anything. But, it's clear that Israel was exercising a degree of restraint, whether that was because of American urging or because of their own organic desire not to get involved in a bigger conflict while they're occupied with the fight in Gaza, lower level fight in Hezbollah. We don't know. But in the long term, right now, the way things are, the economics and the logic favors the offense in a missile war.
Just if I may add something to that, which I fully agree with Dave on all the points that he raised, is that I think also, apart from the economy and all this balance and defense equation, which always been in favor of defense, there's also really, it's about the efficiency of missile defense. Well, I know that at the beginning of this talk, we had this sort of percentage of success of 95% of Israeli air defense, which I want to get a bit deeper in that because that's something that many people talk. And I think it's important to notice that how we arrive to that 90%. Well, I think first we need to break down that what we are talking about. Are we talking about a drone defense, like the Shahed sort of drone defense, or we're talking about a cruise defense or missile defense? So consider that from these 300 objects that were fired, only 110 were missiles, and only from this 110, again said by the media, half of them or a large part of them failed not because of the missile defense but because of their own technical failures. So we're talking about a scenario that missile defense was, and then we know that something around 10 to 15 missiles hit their targets in two bases. So basically we're talking about a scenario that probably 60 to 70 fired missiles, from 60 to 70 fired missiles which successfully continued their trajectory to the Israeli territory, 10 or 15 hit their missiles. So success rate when it comes to missile defense is much lower than what we usually think about the drones. It's again a different story when we talk about the cruise missiles. So knowing this complexity is important. And that's exactly, I think, where, as I said, the way that Iranian thinking is working is on operation, on playing with the operation, playing with or adjusting the factor of how you operate your systems rather than on technology. The way that Israeli way of war is moving seems to be more technological, using on assets that are more technologically advanced. So we're basically seeing sort of this two-way or two approach of looking at the war. And then the result for sure is not clear, but what we can see, at least my initial understanding, is a sort of a balance between them. I think the Israeli restraint is not just coming from outside pressure. The Israeli restraint is coming from two facts. First, an understanding that its staunchest enemy is ready to use force. That is an understanding which was not there when Israelis were thinking about doing that strike against the consulate. I mean, I'm not convinced that strike was tactical. I think going to that location requires chain of command up to the toppest, probably involved in the decision-making cycle. So that means that you have a sort of strategic assessment that your enemy probably is not responding. And that is the basis of the whole story. So the restraint is coming from seeing this scenario that your enemy is ready to use force. Then the strength is coming from a scenario that you see that the balance is very difficult in a sustained situation without your enemy using its full assets, while you have to use your full missile defense capability. We saw that success rate, whatever questions that I raised existing there, being just achieved with use of US forces. CENTCOM was involved, the British, the French. So we are seeing a coalition of a success. So again, when you put all these factors into your calculation, I think the restraint partly is also coming from this realities on the ground, which are very, very much military reality, and understanding about the mistakes, which might be on the overconfidence and on miscalculation of understanding of your enemy.
What do we know about the failure rates of the Iranian missiles, the reported failure rates? Is it a question of quality control in the Iranian defense industry? Is it a question of money or the sanctions preventing quality components? And can a closer economic and strategic relationship with a country such as China or Russia help address these issues for Iran?
I think it's a combination of all of those factors. It could be because of the fact that some of these missiles were stockpiled for a long time in non-standard conditions. And as we know from the open source, some of the components that previously imported to Iran to be used for its missile program were inherently with virus and they were designed to malfunction. So it could be various reasons. In general, I agree that probably if the technological cooperation between Iran and Russia and Iran and China, I have more doubts about Iran and China's technological cooperation on missile technology. What we probably should expect is Iran and Russia. It can probably help Iran to improve its sort of quality control and longer term ability to preserve its missile stockpile. Also, this fact is that Iranians had never ever used in such a scale their own missiles. So for them, is probably also a new reality that they are getting, or that may change their own internal understanding of their capabilities, and we may see a change there, or maybe a new priority there. As if you remember, for years the Iranian missile program was very much focused on range. Then it changed the strategy, focusing on preciseness of the strikes. Then it was the speed, the hypersonic, the Fatah missile. So might be the next wave on the quality and better managed and stockpile system. Could be one of the learnings of this operation for the Iranian side.
Certainly. Iran is certainly trying to enter the arms supply market in a much greater way these days. They are selling their wares all over Africa, all over Asia. Do we think that the experience of the April attacks might have any impact on the global demand for Iranian missile tech?
Yeah, unfortunately. I visited Iranian military industries booth at a weapons fair a while ago, and I still have the bag that I use for my shopping every once in a while. It's just an unfortunate factor of weapons that something that's combat tested is usually that helps you sell it to people who are doing it. I think, though, that we are going to argue over the effectiveness of this for a long, long time, over the competence of the weapons. And I think we're going to argue over what was targeted, what was not targeted, what hit in a significant place and what was let go because it was judged to be going to an insignificant location. I think there's no doubt, though, that sanctions have had an effect on at least one capability, which is the ability to have controlled drones controlled in flights that would require a camera and electrical optical. We know that that's one key area that has been restrained in the Shahed drones in particular. So I think by and large, the countries that have decided to buy Iranian weapons, are going to buy Iranian weapons, and they pretty much already had. These are countries that are on the margin strategically in places like Africa that are, extremely cost conscious and also have no hopes of becoming military partners or security partners with the Western countries in the immediate future.
All right, thank you. And lastly, the Iranian nuclear weapons program is again in the news. Certainly became a topic of conversation after the April exchanges between Iran and Israel. What do the past several months reveal about the Iranian military and political leadership's willingness to escalate, and how does this translate into Iran's pursuit of nuclear weapons and its ability to reassert a viable deterrence? Farzam, I'll start with you.
Iran doesn't have a military doctrine, and it's really hard to extract its military strategy. So one of the key factors that we usually use for this end is the speech and public speech that military commanders do. I think the public speech that General Salami, the commander-in-chief of IRGC, made last week was quite an important one. It laid out some of the long-term Iran's strategy. My understanding is that Iranians are quite confident that they are going to keep this trend of responding to any major Israeli strike. So I use major because I think part of the previous factors which constrained the Iranian response are still valid. Like, for example, the level of deniability of Israeli strike, the public cost that Iran should absorb, and the scale, still matters. And these are the factors that shape the Iranian response. But if these factors are big enough and not deniable publicly and quite costly for Iran, I think Iran has already made its mind that it should respond directly. And that trend is not irreversible. I think it's important that we take these public speech seriously, because I see them as their clear sort of, announcement of strategic decisions. Saying that, as I said, this is conditional to the scale of the incident that we're seeing. So what I'm trying to say is that it's not easy to argue that we can return back to pre-April equation. This for sure has changed. The scale of its change, really, we need to wait and see, but definitely it has changed. On the nuclear side, I honestly, despite all the lots of debates that we are seeing, as I said before, I still believe that Iranians are quite confident in their conventional deterrence. They don't see really that much military rationale to move toward the nuclear deterrence. And the current incident even fortified their understanding or their perception of confidence over their conventional deterrence. This was my argument even before the April incident. I think they managed to activate sort of mass activation of axis of resistance when Yemenis, Houthis started to fire missiles against Israel and hitting the ships in the Red Sea. So Iranians were already in an understanding that they have the capacity to activate multiple fronts and create a massive regional cost for Israel in case they wanted. So those incidents already improved their confidence on their conventional deterrence. And I think when we talk about their nuclear deterrence, this is always the core of their strategic thinking. If their conventional deterrence falls or goes toward the direction of unsustainable pattern, we are there in a risk of a nuclear escalation. But I don't really see that we are there. I think Iranians are quite concerned about the costs of a nuclear escalation in the sense that they go to build the bomb and they don't see the need for it. And adding to that is that, just in this last point, I think that scenario in which Iran can build a nuclear bomb without testing that is irrelevant. So Iranians need to test that because of operational requirements of such a warhead. No military in the world except to bring in a nuclear warhead without being tested. This is not a scenario of US or Russia that can do the simulations. Here, it's an actual operational requirement to do the test. And doing a test for Iran means getting out of the NPT, immediately going under UN sanctions and violation of all international commitments that it has. And that is a very costly path. I think the Saudi-Iranian normalization and the regional sort of rapprochements that they have is also another element that constrains them. So all in all, the regional environment and their perception of deterrence are all the factors that tells me that we are not really in that urgency that Iran might change its nuclear policy, although they want to pose to others this way of thinking that they are in the verge of doing that or they may doing that. But I think we are very far from that scenario.
Paradoxically, I think that the fact that Iran thinks it's established conventional deterrence is a really good thing, because why put all your effort into the nuclear stuff? Why go to that cost and expense of something that is going to give you trouble with most of the international community? You don't get anything from it. You already have conventional deterrence. Furthermore, I think that the Iranians have a political benefit here where everybody pays attention to them as they get up to the line of acquiring a nuclear capability. But as Farzam said, once they cross that line, they're in the outer darkness. So I think that politically what Iran needs to do is create a series of steps that are between an actual nuclear capability and where they are now in order to get world attention and effort to get them not to do those steps. They can take those steps or not, but once they take the big one, they're out of luck. So paradoxically, this attack may be indicative of a bright future for those who seek to keep an Iranian nuclear capability in check.
All right, thank you. Any final thoughts? And would either of you want to plug anything that you're working on or will be releasing soon? Dave, I'll start with you first.
I have a chapter on Saudi defense reform in Mark Thompson's book on Vision 2030 that should be out soon, and that's it.
Yeah, thank you. I just point out to two work of mine, which one is both of them are getting out soon. One is about Iran's foreign policy establishment, which is a chapter in Mehran Kamrava's book. Actually, that one has already released. I recommend really that one for anyone who's interested to understand how decision-making in security area is taking in Iran. And then there's an upcoming work on WMD free zone where we bring all the Iranian, Israeli, and Arab world's nuclear policy all together and see what would be the future of non-proliferation in the Middle East in a comprehensive way. And I recommend people look at the UNIDIR website, UN Institute for Disarmament Research, to find that research out.
That's all the time we have this week. You can follow all of MEI's coverage of Iran, Israel, and broader Middle Eastern security affairs on our website at www.mei.edu. Thank you to our listeners for tuning in and to our production team for their work on this week's episode. You can follow MEI on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and subscribe to our email newsletters for the latest analysis and information about upcoming events. We hope you will listen in again next time.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.